welcome to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those joining the program for the first time, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is a special guest, Yusuf Gupa. He's a political intelligence analyst, strategist, OSINT specialist, and Chatham House CFC fellow who is based in Nigeria. Today we'll be discussing a very relevant topic, which is the coup in Niger and the role of Wagner in this development as well as in West Africa in general. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yusuf. And before we begin, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your research, your professional background, how you came to be specializing in this area?
Okay, thank you, Irina. It's a great opportunity to be here today, and hello to all the viewers. As you said, my name is Yusuf Gupa, and I'm a political intelligence analyst. I started my career as a political analyst with Bulwark Intelligence Solutions, and basically my role involved analyzing and monitoring political events in the country and also writing up ads on naughty global affairs issues. Then I also worked with Stairs Insights, where I provided geopolitical insights into the Nigerian political landscape during the just recently concluded 2023 elections.
That's quite impressive. And since then, there's been a lot of going on. There's been multiple coups in West African countries in the last
Indeed,
several
indeed.
years, and now we're seeing a lot of activity going on, the events happening in Niger. So I'm actually going to start with the most hot button issue, the latest rumors saying that Wagner has taken up an office in Niger. Is that true, or is that something that's still in the negotiations stage?
Well, I cannot verify that, though it's making the rounds on social media that Wagner has, the founder, Prigozhin, had spoken about it. He made comments to the effect that the coup in Niger was reflective of the Nigerians fighting against colonialism, and also made a pitch for his mercenaries to be there. There are also unconfirmed reports that Wagner mercenaries are presently on Nigerian soil, but like I said, I can't confirm that at the moment. There's a lot going on, so there is no credible evidence to show that indeed Wagner troops have landed in Niger.
So let's go back a little bit. Wagner has been initially it has been making progress all over Africa. It's been quite involved in DRC. It has attempted to be involved in Mozambique, but with mixed results and unsuccessful results against the jihadist groups there. Then it kind of made its position in Mali and Burkina Faso. Now, West African countries have been essentially ousting the French influence from the vicinity, and Russia and Wagner specifically have been benefiting from that. So I don't think too many people will argue with that statement. What is less clear is to what extent these coups and this anti-French sentiment is fueled by local interests and how much of it is Russian propaganda and incitement. How much is Russia actually piggybacking off ongoing local opposition interests versus actually playing an active role in creating and generating this opposition. I'd be curious to hear what you think about this.
I think it's an interesting take there because I'd say it's a hybrid. Hybrid in the sense that indeed there are local sentiments. These
Mhm.
local sentiments are not born out of thin air. The French colonial legacy in Francophone Africa is damning and it's atrocious, and this has led a lot of inhabitants of those regions to be very strongly resolute against France. So the anti-French sentiments are quite strong, and that's why you have French troops being kicked out of every part of the Sahel, barring Niger. And again, it's instructive that Niger itself has also been involved in the coup. And one of the first things that the junta did was kick out France. So, as a remote cause of that coup, it's telling that the Nigerian military wasn't happy that their country was the last bastion of the West in the Sahel. They were unhappy that the political leadership of the country was comfortable harboring troops that were kicked out of every other part of the Sahel. So that was the remote cause of the coup. And then on the other hand, like I said, it's a hybrid. So Wagner offers disinformation services. It's troll farm through its IRA. They offer these services to regimes and they're able to weaponize the sentiments through propaganda online. They're able to play on the anti West sentiments and portray Russia as a true partner in this regard. But I mean, in the reality is that they're also there for access to resources, as we've seen in Mozambique and in Central African Republic. They're there for access to gold and diamond mines. Niger happens to have one of the most vast uranium deposits. So if they're in Niger, that's one of the things that's going to be on the table, definitely.
Now, let's look into the French, anti-French sentiment for a moment. On the one hand, you have this history of colonial and neo-colonial presence. On the other hand, France has been playing a leading role in counter-terrorism operations. Without a doubt, there had been warning signs long before the Mali coups and everything else that followed that there was a growing popular discontent with the French presence. What exactly were the most recent developments that spurred this reaction after, a period of time where France was more or less tolerated? And why did the French miss these warning signs?
I wouldn't say the French have missed these warning signs because of lately the French President Macron has been trying to recalibrate the French policy in Africa, but
Mhm.
it's unfortunate for them that it hasn't got the effect that they wanted. He's spoken about partnership, he's spoken about reparation, been involved in giving back artifacts that were stolen during the colonial times that were taken from Africa. So these are moves that are indicative of the fact that Macron recognizes that French has erred in Africa in terms of colonialism, and it should do some reparation. But again, these sentiments built up over time. You know, I think it's still existing today, whereby French guarantees the currencies of the countries in Francophone Africa, and about half of their reserves are given to the French central bank. Now, this form of dominance is it's an insult to sovereignty of any country. That a country will have its currency, national tender guaranteed by another country, and its reserves will have to be there. It's telling that the country can't stand on its feet. And these are the kind of things that push the young inhabitants of Francophone Africa to kick back against France and say, you know what, we've had it. We see no reason why this should continue. We want to stand on our feet. We want to be a country, given our vast resources, that is able to relate with the outside world without a patronizing partner there. So these are the kind of sentiments.
There's been some rumors that France has actually backed some of the earlier coups before the later coups that were essentially co-opted by Russian-linked PMCs. To what extent France justified this sort of involvement in these political upheavals, and what were they hoping to accomplish?
I would say that they were hoping to accomplish a situation whereby any of the junta leaders would be a partner for them because they understand that their influence in the Sahel is waning and they will do everything to make sure that any of these leaders is on their side. But unfortunately, that's not the case. In the four countries you mentioned, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, all of these leaders are anti-France. In fact, in Mali, Assimi Goïta came out to say that French language is going to be banned in the country. Ironically, he made that declaration in French. So it's telling of the fact that these people are fed up. They're very fed up. In Nigeria's own case, I've heard that the junta also is kicking out French troops, and France has also started evacuating its citizens. So they understand that this is a game of influence. Traditionally, they have been the partner and the ally, but the people on the other side are fed up and they're reaching towards Russia.
Interestingly enough, France is very much outspoken about supporting democracy and liberal values and human rights, etc., etc.
Yeah, indeed. And
But
something comes to mind here.
but
Yeah,
this seems to
in
be
Chad,
mhm, seems to be kind of
yeah,
counter.
in Chad, the president Muhammad Idris Deby,
Mhm.
basically what happened was transitional, was inherited leadership. His father was there, having been a military leader. retired from the military. He was there. The French supported him. He died on the front lines. Then his son came in from the army through a coup, and France also supported the coup, knowing fully well that he was on their side. So this is in contrast to the democratic and liberal ideals that France preaches.
So when we have a face in the face of rhetoric that's pro-democratic rhetoric, what appears to be double standards or hypocrisy, or at the very least political inconsistency, essentially the choice for the people seems to be between if is not between democracy and pro-democratic Western countries and authoritarian Russia, but between two forms of authoritarianism from their perspective.
Sure, sure, sure. Because even the so-called democratic leaders in the continent were exactly democratic.
Mhm.
Coups do not happen in vacuum. There are certain underlying factors that fuel them, and that is why the populations there are receptive to these coups. So it's quite telling that, take Niger for instance. President Bazoum has spent 2 years in power, and after being ousted by the coup, we saw Nigerians who voted him hitting the streets in support of the junta. So it's ironic that the junta has more legitimacy than the president they voted into power. I think this is a question we should be asking. Why are Nigerians in support of the junta more than the government that they elected with their own hands?
And that is a major question. There's been a lot of criticism of the Western African governments about corruption, weakness of the law enforcement, human rights abuses,
Mhm.
and quite simply not living up to the needs of the population in terms of education, empowerment of women, young people, and so forth. But to what extent has it become a problem that's unresolvable and sustained and systematically not purgeable? I mean, 2 years is not a long time to in power to change the entire system, but at the same time, you can see indications of whether or not things are moving in the right directions. So, what was it that
True.
created such a big problem with this presidency that the population came out in support over military, dictatorial form of government and embraced, anti-colonial rhetoric? What was it the president's relations with the West? Was it some domestic program? What were these factors?
To be fair to President Bazoum, his leadership of Nigeria in this short time had seen massive improvements. Now, the coup leaders, in citing the reason for executing that coup, said that they gave the standard textbook response, deteriorating security and economic conditions. But according to the African Center for Strategic Studies, Nigeria has had a decline in fatalities from jihadist deaths and also 7% rise in terms of economic growth. So Niger, relatively in comparison to its neighbors that were led by the military, was witnessing progress. And this now brings us to the reason why the population supported his ouster. It was because he was leaning to the West. His country was the last bastion of the West in the Sahel. He was comfortable. The political leadership of Niger was comfortable, being a hub for Western imperialism in the Sahel. Niger is the only country in the Sahel that had French troops, American troops, Italian troops, and German troops. The United States has about 3 bases there. Germany has a logistics outpost. French troops are there. So, I mean, the partnership that the West had with Niger was an issue, both for the Nigerian military and the Nigerian people. On both sides, both parts were uncomfortable with this relationship. But the political leadership wasn't reading the room enough. They were not noticing that their people were fed up. And it was looking like as if this wave of anti-French sentiments in the Sahel wasn't going to reach them. They had seen how in other parts of the Sahel, in Mali and Burkina Faso, the military there had ousted the leadership that was leaning towards France and also harnessed the sentiments for the people. It's ordinarily speaking, the people are supposed to revolt against the military government, given that it's an abuse of power. But there's this seeming cooperation because they're on the same side. Same side being they both harbor anti-West sentiments very strongly. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Mhm. So the European Union in particular put in a lot of money into the Sahel, into forming a five country partnership on counter-terrorism issues. There's, the troops from various European countries have been stationed there for about 10 years at this point. They are considered a significant factor in fighting various terrorist organizations. So why hasn't this problem been solved after over a decade of all these foreign troops being stationed? And why hasn't the military aid given to these countries been sufficient to train the militaries to become independent and resolve the problem of this foreign presence, or at least minimize it?
Well, to that, I would say that because the solution is multifaceted, it's not kinetic, it's also non kinetic. Much more than the force that is being deployed, there is a need to devote critical resources into making sure that the people receive improved economic conditions, because this is a factor in terms of terrorism and stemming the tide of it. To make people less receptive to terrorist rhetoric, improving their economic conditions goes a long way. And this is one problem that Sahel has witnessed. It's one of the poorest parts of the world. So these resources that have been synced into military partnerships also need to be synced into economic conditions and governance outcomes, because it's an improvement of governance outcomes that people will be less receptive to terrorist rhetoric, to taking up arms against the state. So there's a complexity that kinetic means alone cannot solve.
And presumably, none of these countries that were involved in this counterterrorism context were really all that focused on these non-kinetic factors. They were not really all that invested.
Well, Niger, to be fair, President Bazoum was actually, he was in Niger. Niger was witnessing, like I said, the decline in fatalities. They had this reparation program whereby repentant terrorists would be rehabilitated back into society. So Niger was on that path slowly and gradually, but unfortunately, it's been cut short by the junta.
So this anti-colonial sentiment was in fact stronger than whatever security and economic benefits that were coming out of this democratic elected government reform.
I will say so. I will say so. I will say so. Because ordinarily, when the junta comes and says, oh, you know what? The reason why we have taken power is because the political leadership has failed to secure the country and improve economic conditions. And in that part where they mention secure the country, we should be asking them, because they are called people. They're the military. They're the ones who have sworn an oath to protect and defend the country. So when the country is becoming insecure, we should ask them what they're doing. But people aren't doing that. People are on the side because the avalanche of anti-West sentiments are very strong.
So what has contributed to this messaging? Was it just Russia playing this anti-foreign, anti-French sentiment, or were there other sources of information warfare that were basically fueling this wave?
Oh yeah, so there's information warfare going on. I don't know if you're on Twitter, but if you are, it's from my point of view on Twitter. Every day in day out, I see propaganda and rhetoric. I see rhetoric indicating that the recent ouster of this political leadership by the military mirrors that of revolutionaries in the past. So they're tying the activities of these young soldiers, people like Thomas Sankara and the rest, African revolutionaries who understood what they were doing and who fought colonialism with their hearts and mind. They're tying the activities of these young soldiers to that. And in doing that, you're whipping up sentiments of nationalism, sentiments of resistance to imperialism and colonialism.
So in light of this very understandable sentiment, why is it that the same people are willing to embrace another foreign power, regardless of what you think about Russia's domestic agenda or the war in Ukraine or anything else? It's just taking just bare facts. It's another foreign country doing exactly what those same thing as these European countries have done. Why?
Indeed.
So why hasn't it received an equal amount of anti-foreign backlash?
This is $1 million question. I saw a picture on Al Jazeera when a protester in coming out in support of the coup had a placard. On the placard, it read, "Long live Niger, long live Russia, death to France." And I think it's instructive. It's instructive because Russia doesn't have the colonial baggage that France has. And that is why it's being regarded as a true partner in quotation marks. Because ordinarily speaking, the people are to be discerning enough to understand that the problems that they have with France, they're also going to have with Russia. Because Russia's involvement there, barring the influence, is also an issue of extraction. Because And Francophone Africa doesn't deem itself an equal partner to France. And in inviting Russia, as a savior in quotation marks, they're also going to be an equal partner because extraction is going to go on. But I guess this absence of colonial baggage is in Russia's favor. Yeah. And in addition to their propaganda.
So, so we already know that this is not the first round of such West versus, Russia competitions. The Soviet Union was pursuing identical tactic back in the day in various African countries with the results that have yet to be fully resolved to these days. We know that some of the African countries still have a neo-Marxist kind of rhetoric mixed in with some of the other long-term governance issues resulting from that sort of dominance. Why hasn't that sort of I understand that Russia does not have the same level of control over West Africa specifically that France had, but it has had significant historic influence in other African countries. Why hasn't that been a warning sign in the Sahel? What is it that they are hoping to get from Russia that they did not get from France?
Yes. Now, I mentioned unequal partnerships, and perhaps that is it, in addition to the baggage.
Mm-hmm.
So, what they didn't get from France was a fair deal. That was what they didn't get from France. France controlled the exportation, France controlled the currency, France controlled, guaranteed their resources also, in addition to a part of their national currency being stacked up in French banks. This is the unequal partnership I'm speaking about. And this is what Russia hasn't done. Perhaps not yet. We don't know what it will look like, this partnership in the future. But as of the moment, Russia doesn't have this baggage. What Russia has portrayed itself to be is a partner, a true partner, someone, a country that understands that this region is going through its own issues and is willing to support it, obviously for a pricely sum, be it resources.
One particular, from my understanding, one particular painful point between France and Niger has been the issue of uranium and not getting basically a good deal from the French exploitation of uranium for its energy sector. That issue has been renegotiated several times. There have been taxes that were raised in 2012. There's been a new attempt to approach that, but nevertheless, even after all this time, that has never been fully resolved. Why was that not fully negotiated? Why hasn't Niger been able to assert a full partnership over its resources?
Yeah, and this question you've asked me borders on one of the things that affects the Nigerian youths because they see a stipulation in the sense that in terms of the export of uranium that Nigeria does, France has a fixed percentage in this regard. A fixed percentage. I think it's somewhere around 15 to 18% of Nigeria's uranium goes to France, powers France nuclear energy and even the Eiffel Tower. You know, and this fixed percentage, as you said, the country has in several times tried to bargain, but no. Despite what the market is saying in terms of international prices, what France pays for it does not reflect. And in hindsight, France's dealing with Niger and other parts of Francophone Africa should have been fair. Because if it was fair, we would not be where we are today. We would not see these anti-French sentiments leading to outcomes that we do not know. Because it's on the bulwark of these sentiments that people today are supporting juntas. They are being blindsided. They are being hoodwinked. It's more like, you know what? Because I hate this person, I might as well do what I can to live there. It's finding a solution, not minding if that solution is a problem to the problem that you have right now. So I guess in essence, the main issue here is on fair dealings between France and Francophone Africa.
Mhm. Well, that makes perfect sense. Unfortunately, recent examples of Wagner's approach to natural resources in DRC and Sierra are a cautionary tale because they have been anything but fair. Whatever promised to those governments, Russia has been accused of looting gold mines and so forth, massacring civilians, engaging in human rights abuses, and essentially acting as a criminal gang taking over those resources, not even as an unequal and parochial power, but simply looting things outright. What can be done to prevent such an outcome in Niger?
I think one thing I would say is there's a need. I don't know if ECOWAS is going to fill this vacuum or it's going to be Nigeria who's the regional power. But there is a vacuum in the Francophone media space, in the France Afrique media space that needs to be filled. There is an absence of discerning narratives to understand how countries relate with each other and what is an equal partnership and what is an unequal partnership. Because what this part of the world accuses France of, Russia is doing the same. So if it is changing chains, it's a problem because it's still in chains.
Mhm.
The people there need to understand that they're a region that is blessed with a lot of natural resources and they need to stand on their feet as opposed to looking for a partner in quotation marks that is going to help them harness these resources. So I don't know who's going to fill this media space because the absence of these narratives has allowed Russian propaganda in combination with anti-France sentiments to reign supreme.
To some degree, healthy nationalism could fuel a national rebirth and generate better leadership, better political approach, as well as a willingness and ability to negotiate normal trade deals that are beneficial to the country, that do not create inequalities, and at the same time are acceptable to partners. But this
Yeah.
absence of these narratives, you're saying, has created a lack of opportunity for any leaders to emerge who could pursue such a track. So, what exactly is the problem here? I mean, it seems fairly common sense. What you're saying seems exactly the way most countries in the world handle their economic and political issues. Why is there such a unwillingness to confront this problem face off and kind of create this natural national movement that would focus on.
But perhaps we're looking at a lack of sophistication.
Mhm.
Perhaps that's what we're looking at. Because if they were sophisticated enough, strategic communication should not be far off. It should be something that would be recalibrated over time for the outcome that they need. But we are not saying this being injected. The media space in these countries is comfortable with these narratives, knowing fully well that in the absence of a counter, what you're going to continue having is this sentiment of anti-West sentiments leaning towards Russia with no beneficial outcome for the people who are being affected.
Let's look at the granular level of development. After, there were warning red flags about this anti-Western statement even before the coup happened, because about a week
Mhm.
prior, UN peacekeepers were expelled from the country, and that actually generated relatively little attention globally outside the UN itself. But to me, it was a very obvious warning sign that things were headed in some very strange direction. Why is it that no one was paying attention to this ejection of these UN peacekeepers, and how did it lay ground for the events that followed?
I think they refuse to acknowledge the glaring reality. It's always been there, like you said. These sentiments have always been there. Over years, it has been building up. But perhaps because the West, and France particularly, has been a traditional ally of this region, they felt so comfortable that, you know what, they felt perhaps nothing would happen. Barring these sentiments is always something that can be done about it. Perhaps it's supporting a leader that leans towards you, or it's influencing them through a civil society. But right now, we're having none of that. I'm not even seeing the role of civil society in this. What is happening clearly is juntas playing on the sentiments of their population, to usurp power and perpetuate themselves. So I feel like it was refused to be acknowledged because it has been glaring from day one.
Now, I'm going to ask something a little bit provocative, but I think that bears acknowledging in light of recent events. In the winter, in December last year, the Washington held a U.S. Africa Leaders Summit that was parallel to African leadership, political leadership. There was also a business oriented conference or gathering of exchange of private companies attempting to build and strengthen ties. And shortly before this chain of events, there was also a US Africa summit in Botswana. What happened between then and now? There were all sorts of promises made about the support for anti-corruption reforms and education and all these things and civil society, all these non-kinetic factors that were essential to support. Has any of it actually materialized? At least in West Africa, at least in these countries.
Perhaps not that I'm aware of. I think, again, over the last few years, there has been a lot of chatter to the effect that America's Africa strategy is winning. It's not putting its money where its mouth is. So there's a lot of talk about partnership with Africa.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this summit felt like an afterthought because this between this summit and the last one, there's been a number of years. There's been a number of years. So it was arguments to the effect that the US is not doing enough to harness its influence in Africa. It was a lot of chatter about French, Turkish, and Chinese influence. So it's this wrestling for influence that made the US think of that summit as a counter. So you can see that Africa is not on the front burner for the USA. At least not that it's portrayed, not like it's portraying it to be. And in the way that they support governments and civil society and the narratives that they push towards the populace, there needs to be a change. There needs to be a change. They need to understand the peculiarities of people, their political history, their psychology, and use this as a basis to relate to them. There's no what's it called, one size fits all solution here. It's
Mm-hmm.
peculiarities. The peculiarities of Francophone Africa and Anglophone Africa are not the same. Nigeria and Niger are countries that border each other, but there are also differences in terms of political leadership and political history. So the US cannot be relating with Nigeria the way it relates in Niger Republic.
Mm-hmm. It sounds to me that among other problems, there's simply also an absence of expertise on regional issues, or at least one that goes beyond superficial counterterrorism issues.
Yes. Yes, so groundedness is an issue here. Groundedness is an issue here. There needs to be groundedness. They need to be on ground to see the realities for themselves. Much more than narratives that they will get from wherever they get it from, they need to be on ground. And the US is pumping resources into Africa. In Niger that we're talking about, the US has a drone base and it has an air base. So it should know it's on ground. Why this intelligence is not harnessed for a better outcome for both sides, I don't seem to know.
There seems to be a very big disconnect between military intelligence focused on the very narrow tactical issues that the military is dealing with and the sort of more diplomatic, broad understanding of social issues that is required to make policy decisions. The question is, after this expected pivot to Africa that's been, that we have heard back and forth through the various administrations for the past 20 plus years, how that hasn't yet happened or materialized at all, especially despite these current realities. And my understanding is that US has been pushing to kind of re-engage in Africa, but on issues of primary concern to its own interests, which are rare earths, minerals, energy, and other natural resources. And they have tried to counter China influence, but not by any social engagement, but by simply trying to just get ahead in terms of securing access to these natural resources, which has not gone over as well. So is it that US footprint in these countries remains basically imperceptible or is seen as basically very short-term and interest rather than partnership oriented, despite the rhetoric about partnerships?
I think it's a bit of all what you said. Now, in terms of the dealings of the USA in Africa, the USA is clearly engaging in Africa for influence. It wants to be able to harness African influence in the United Nations and in the world stage to counter China and to counter Russia. That's on
Mhm.
one hand. On the other hand, what we can see that China does in Africa is certain strategic partnerships that seemingly benefit both sides. Keyword is seemingly benefit both sides. I use Nigeria as an example.
Mhm.
Nigeria has an infrastructural deficit. Over the years, in the last administration of President Buhari, China has been a partner in bridging this deficit. Railways, bridges, and roads, the Chinese have funded and built this infrastructure in Nigeria in partnership with the Nigerian government. Now, these are hard infrastructure Nigerian people can see because they use them on a daily basis. This infrastructure facilitates economic outcomes and it eases the movement of goods and services. Nigeria can see in real time what partnership with China feels like, but they cannot see in real time what partnership with the US it feels like. So just maybe it's imperceptible, like you said.
So we're talking about, that soft power influence without some sort of tangible economic benefit is not really going to cut it here, even if it's, at its most effectiveness, which I'm willing to wager it's probably not. So the question is, we are seeing all these, the US and other countries' reaction to the Niger coup has been rather fumbled. They have expressed disappointment, they have expressed concern, they threatened sanctions, but there hasn't been much of a strategy to respond to this development that comes so soon after multiple other coups in the region. What is missing from the US understanding of the region that they are not able to develop something more long term and more responsive to these conditions and just issues toothless statements?
I think this is a loaded question because in Nigeria, particularly, there's only so much that they can do. They can talk about pulling their aid, and in fact, their aid has been instructive in terms of. I mean, I read an op-ed by President Bazoum where he said that 40% of the Nigerian budget in his administration came from aid from the West. So these partnerships at the political level, there's an awareness about it, but the social level, perhaps there's not. And now, in reacting to this coup, how do they do so? Now, they've talked about sanctions, they've talked about supporting ECOWAS and Nigeria's firm posture against this. But how is the coup in Niger rolled back without creating a bigger problem? As I had said earlier, Niger is the buffer between Nigeria and the larger Sahel and instability. So, in correcting this coup, any military intervention is going to cause a bigger problem. So, in lieu of this fact, there needs to be pragmatism. As much as we can condemn the coup and agree that coups are usurpation of power, military intervention in this regard will create a bigger problem. So, there needs to be a gradual and slow approach to wind this back and roll this back.
What can be done to do that? So far, we've seen statements from ECOWAS threatening military invasion, which immediately had a whole host of countries, including, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea, promising to send military aid to the new to the junta in power. Obviously, that did not materialize. Today is Sunday. They gave a big notice to roll back the coup. It did not happen, and now they went and asked supposedly Wagner for assistance. I'm saying supposedly not because Wagner is not involved, but because I'm not sure about the timeline of events. I suspect Wagner was already involved in backdoor negotiations long before the coup actually took place, which is why saying now that they just went and asked them for help seems to be a little bit, uh, just a public gesture for something that's been long in the works anyway. So
Yeah.
we're seeing these empty threats that engendered counter threats and ultimately led to absolutely nothing. What do and quite frankly, because of these empty threats were issued and were not in fact undertaken, now ECOWAS has less leverage than if they hadn't said anything to begin with. What exactly, who
Indeed,
and what
indeed.
and how can now make a difference in trying to roll back this situation?
Yeah, in fact, many analysts felt like ECOWAS put the cart before the horse.
Mm-hmm.
It did not exhaust all forms of diplomacy before threatening force. And this partnership that you are seeing among the coup belt, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, is misplaced esprit de corps because they know that by any stretch, any military intervention in Niger that is successful will not stop there. It's going to rout out every single one of them. So they are expressing partnership in lieu of the fact that they understand that if any outstar of the junta in Nigeria is successful, they're next. But in terms of what can be done to roll this back, I think Nigeria is going to play a large role, barring the fact that Niger and Nigeria neighbor each other. Nigeria is also the regional powerhouse. It has cultural, socio-cultural, and economic ties to Niger. So this needs to be leveraged on. There are political ties that need to be leveraged on. Diplomacy must be exhausted in all forms. We can start by negotiating for the release of President Bazoum. There's no reason why he should be in custody. He could be released in Niger or Nigeria in exile. From there, that can be followed up by understanding the long-term plans of the junta and knowing what their timetable is like because they can't stay there forever. Coups succeed coups. So it's even in their own interest to hand over to a civilian government. So by establishing a transitional governance structure and then a timetable for civilian rule, these are the kind of what's it called arguments that we should be putting forth before these people. It's not glamorous because it's not surgical and swift, but it doesn't carry the risk of a Libya 2.0 in the Sahel because the Sahel as it stands today is 80% destabilized. Niger is the 20%. If Niger falls, we're going to be in problem. Now, the US, France, they would, as much as they would support a military intervention from their posture, the consequences of that they're going to be far removed from. So us in the continent, it behoves us to speak the way we're speaking right now and call for caution.
Now, all of that makes complete and perfect sense, and in fact, this is exactly what was supposed to happen in Sudan. But all of a sudden, we see that the civilian traditional government or process failed completely. Now there's a power struggle between two warlords and a civil war between different tribes that's increasing and becoming worse. And now there are foreign groups also intervening and getting involved. Spillover effects, border security issues, all sorts of things happening, situation completely getting out of control. What can be done to prevent that from happening and prevent the process from being co-opted or disrupted by self-interested political factions?
I think here two things. Number one is sanctions will be utilized as a form of stick and carrot, as an incentive and as a deterrent. When this process begins, given the leverage that Nigeria has over this country, Nigeria provides electricity for Niger. At this point, has been cut. Niger is landlocked, so a lot of exportation that Niger does and importation comes from Nigeria. A lot of aid too comes from Nigeria. So these are sectors whereby we can focus on carrot and stick. When we see that the plan is being adhered to, these things go well. When we see recalcitrance on the part of the junta, we roll these things back. Another solution here is that vacuum that I had spoken about earlier. I think Nigeria needs to assume the position of a peace broker as opposed to an aggressor. In this absence of a narrative or partnership in the Sahel, Nigeria needs to come out clearly to these countries and say, look, we understand that you have sentiments against the West, given their colonial history here. But this time around, this is an issue between brothers. We are interested in the outcomes of your country because we are brothers. We are proximate, we border each other. The futures of our country are tied together, they're entwined. So this is the kind of narrative that Nigeria should be injecting in the France-Afrique media space. It does this in collaboration with the sanctions, and I think we might have an outcome that saves us the risk of the Libyanization of the Sahel for the second time.
I think you're proposing something very interesting here, which is a local solution to conflict management, conflict resolution. Up until now, there's been this perception that for whatever reason, regional conflicts need complete outside mediation or intervention to be resolved even diplomatically. Here you're saying Nigeria could locally play that role. It has enough gravitas, enough local influence and enough credibility among all sides to pursue that role. To what extent do you see signs that this might be happening, that the government is ready to undertake that responsibility?
Well, as of the moment, the last set of envoys that were sent by Nigeria involved the Sultan of Sokoto, and the Sultan is a traditional and religious leader of northern Nigeria. And prior to colonialism, his caliphate spanned all the way to Niger. So that is the kind of influence that Nigeria has over Niger that can be leveraged on. And this is the kind of partnership that lies between both countries. In northern Nigeria, out of the 19 states, at least 7 border Niger Republic. And in these states that border Niger Republic, there is no border, actually. The people see themselves as one. The people see themselves as one. So as of the moment, given the fact that ECOWAS made the undertaking that it did, the senators in the Nigerian National Assembly, the parliamentarians from northern Nigeria have come out to speak against a military intervention in Nigeria because they understand that the repercussions will be felt in their constituencies. So Nigeria has a large role and stake to play here. At the moment, it is playing it, but it can have a more adept, approach to it.
Mm-hmm. So in the meantime, while all of this is happening, as we saw, the junta allegedly approached Wagner, asked for its assistance. Do we know exactly what sort of assistance and to what extent um, they're asking Wagner to get involved, especially in light of the rhetoric that supposedly Wagner has reduced its operations in Africa? Can they be that? Can they provide the level of support that the junta is expecting, logistically speaking?
Yes, given Wagner's ill-fated rebellion with the Kremlin, a lot of people have said that Wagner, it will be difficult, to have them present in Nigeria given that issue. But I don't think that would happen. I think that Russia uses Wagner as a foreign policy tool.
Mhm.
And in this regard, there is an opportunity for Russia to extend its influence. There's no reason why it shouldn't continue. Now, in terms of what kind of support the junta will receive, we do not know, for certain, but we can speculate. Wagner generally offers 3 kinds of services. It's disinformation services, it's combat operation services, and what it calls security services. So the junta is probably going to need them for disinformation. Quite clearly, given that their populace are a fertile ground for propaganda, I see no reason why, in fact, those services haven't already begun. I think there's enough pointers to the effect that this is in place already, and that Wagner's propaganda is already in place in Niger, given how receptive the populace has been to the junta. That's on one hand. On the other hand, is if there happens to be a military intervention, in terms of securing the capital and also more troops on ground for the junta, I believe that they would request boots on ground from Wagner.
There's been a lot of discussion about Wagner's aggressive recruitment in Africa. How does that process exactly work? What does Wagner offer to the local populations that makes them interested in joining these campaigns on behalf of Russia? What do they get out of it? Is it just the money? Do they get a percentage of their resources? Is it a career prospect of some sort?
I think it's both. I think they'll pay handsomely given the access that they have to natural resources. In Central African Republic, for example, they have unfettered access to gold and diamond mines, and it's from this that they pick out of the local population, arm these guys, and use them as guards. So now, the local populace prior to Wagner's involvement understood that they had these resources, but they had no way in terms of participating in the outcome of it. But by being Wagner troops on ground, excuse me, by bringing Wagner troops on ground, they're involved, in the extraction of these things. So perhaps it has a psychological effect for them. That, oh, you know what, prior to now, all we understood was we had resources. We had no hand in the extraction. And right now, we're involved in the extraction, even if it's to the detriment in the long run. Because that your local populace will be absorbed by mercenaries and funded in the long run is going to create a problem for you. Because again, mercenaries are soldiers of fortune.
Have there been any mention of people leaving Wagner after being recruited?
Not that I'm aware of at the moment. I haven't heard any stories about people leaving after being recruited.
Mhm. So there is another aspect to this whole process, which is what happens to all these natural resources after they're uh, basically after they're forged, after they're taken over. A lot of them are taken out of the continent, moved to the Gulf states or other places that have refining capabilities, and then sold off for profit. Um, and which goes on to fund various Russian operations, whether it's Wagner operations in Africa or whatever else. To what extent do you think this process could be curtailed by putting pressure on the entities that become the recipients of that gold, diamonds, and so forth to not engage? Is that even possible at this point?
I seriously doubt how possible that is. The extraction of these resources are sold on the black market and they fund Russia's budget in addition to Wagner's operation. I think in curtailing this depletion of resources, we should be focused on the locality as opposed to the market where it's being sold. Because if the locals have the capacity to resist this, it will even get into the market, you
Mm.
know. But then by the time it has gone into the market, it's foregone. It's a foregone conclusion. So in strengthening these communities, strengthening these local communities, both through training in terms of making them understand psychologically that in the long run this doesn't benefit you and it's detrimental to you. In addition to also enabling them, you know, giving them resistance to resist this. And again, this is where their political leadership comes into question. And it's unfortunate that again the political leadership, given the fact that now its juntas are in bed with Wagner. So that is very hard.
Meanwhile, we've seen several other states express their concern about what happened publicly, but they have not, as far as I know, undertaken any specific action. We've seen Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Algeria, all fairly active regional players, express, this level of concern. To what extent do you expect to see any sort of engagement or action from them, whether politically, diplomatically, economically? What role can these or will these states play in the events going forward? Do you expect, for instance, Algeria to support the new junta, given the commonalities with the Russia? Do you expect Turkey, given its very complicated relations with Russia, to intervene in any way on a political or social level?
I don't expect any of these countries to intervene militarily. They share a lot in common with Niger. Islam is a binding factor, and I don't expect to see either Saudi Arabia, Algeria, or Turkey send these troops there. I don't expect to see
Mhm.
that. But again, these countries partner with Nigeria for economic outcomes. So just maybe they can use the economic aid that they give as a leverage against the junta. We don't know
Mhm.
how possible that would be, but it's one thing that is possible. Given the amount of aid that Turkey and Saudi Arabia give to Niger, that can be used as a leverage for whatever outcome that they want to have if they don't support the juntas.
Do you see other states, other Muslim majority states, playing a more active role in West Africa now that there is all this, chain of events taking place, and given the uncertainty of Russia's role? I mean, does anyone really expect Wagner to be single-handedly offsetting all these terrorist groups and extremism, ideological extremism, and sectarian issues? To me, it's very
Yeah,
doubtful
true.
that they'll be able to do that.
Yeah, it's doubtful. It's doubtful. I mean, and as of the moment, they haven't done much significantly, even in terms of the kinetic means that they've employed. So Mozambique, Mali, and Guinea are exactly safer given Wagner's involvement in these countries. So even the kinetic means that they boast of, they are found wanting there. But I think, again, Muslim majority countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar have a role to play. The their the resources that they have can be channeled to non-kinetic means. Like I said earlier, this is not an issue that would solely be solved by kinetic means. By empowering communities and improving their economic outcomes, at the same time improving literacy, you know, and understanding. And this is where Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey can come in. When they do all they can by pushing their resources to make sure that extremism is rolled back because extremism plays a large role in the terrorism that we're seeing here. Understanding of whatever it is that is fueling these narratives. When they pump money and this money is used to shape narratives and make people understand that, oh, you know what, this extremism in the long run doesn't benefit you. Much more than that, it is not even reflective of what you claim to be your religion. So you're better off abandoning it. I think that that would play a large role in rolling back this tide of terrorism that we're seeing in the Sahel.
Now, there's been a lot of talk about Wagner and its role in Africa, but besides Wagner, Russia hosts approximately 36 to 37 other malicious PMCs of different levels of influence. Are any of those also present in West Africa, or is Wagner the only real power there?
I think Wagner is the only real power there. I'm aware that the Slavonic Corps was partly operational in the past, and one of its leaders, Dmitry Utkin, I think, has been absorbed by Wagner. So I think Wagner is largely the only PMC operational. And if I remember correctly, in Russian law, PMCs aren't exactly even permitted by law. So, but Wagner's peculiarity again is the fact that Russia uses it as a foreign policy tool.
Mhm. Do you see, uh, do you see Wagner making alliances with any of the local groups, factions, besides the official governments or sectarian movements in order to secure their own presence
Uh,
and avoid being attacked?
I think that is I think that is plausible. In Sudan, Wagner is involved with the RSF, and the RSF is not the government. So we can extrapolate from that that indeed, for access to resources, be it gold, diamond, uranium, for a better stake in these countries, Wagner can indeed involve itself with either of these factions that they feel to be on the winning side.
In terms of so we've been mostly focusing on what actions can be taken to roll back the actual coup and to address the local interests of the local populations. Is there a need for a specific track to target Wagner and their operations by the international community, or will not Wagner naturally disappear as soon as these local issues are resolved and there is a path to a civilian political transition?
I think it's both. I think it's both. As much as it will certainly go a long way in terms of, and I think even at the moment, the US has some forms of sanctions against Wagner. I think those forms of sanctions exist, but they're not doing enough. I also think that again, local political outcomes in these countries would lead to Wagner's outstar. And that is what we should be focused on because it's rather long lasting. Once the people themselves resist and make Wagner understand that we are not in support of you being here, they would leave. There's only so much that they can do. We take, for instance, the USA and its involvement in Afghanistan with the Taliban. After 20 years, it handed that country back again to the Taliban. It's very telling of the fact that without local understanding and strengthening local communities, whatever outcome you're pushing for is largely not going to materialize.
Do you foresee increased security problems as a result of Russia's presence there? Meaning from
Um,
terrorist organizations and local, sectarian disputes and the like.
I would say as a tangent, but not directly. I don't see increased insecurity as a result of Russia's involvement, but I strongly feel like with Wagner's support of these juntas and there being less being done in terms of government's outcomes, terrorism will be a natural consequence of that, but not as a direct consequence.
Indeed, we have seen a lot of discussions in Europe in particular about refugee crisis from Africa, potential for mass migration and so forth. If if these security issues increase, if there is this influx of extremists, we can expect more migration, we can
Migrants.
expect more of
Yes.
what's already happening. How do you expect Europe to handle those issues? Because so far I haven't seen a very clear policy that would address all aspects of the situation, including the fact that if you don't want a refugee crisis, you should help stabilize the countries from which the refugees come from.
Exactly, which is the very instructive point that you've raised. If you do not want a refugee crisis, you play a large role in stability of the government. Now, again, this points to exactly the reason why the West and its partners should be very strategic in what it supports in terms of rolling the schools back. Because if Niger falls and the Sahel collapses, a migrant crisis is something that cannot be controlled. So much more than yes, indeed, they are thousands of kilometers away. They are not going to be affected by the direct consequences. But in the long run, again, you're going to have a migrant crisis, which you do not want, which your population also is not going to support. So it's more reason why support stabilities in these countries. If you don't support it for the benefit of these countries, you support it because you know that you're going to have a migrant crisis on your hands.
Final question is towards the whole situation with the grain deal. Obviously, Russia withdrew from that, but it has agreed to supply a few of the African countries that it supports, 6 countries, with free grain. How do the other countries that are not receiving the same deal reaction to that? And do you see any sort of a regional dialogue discussion of Russia's role in creating this food insecurity situation?
I think Niger was the only country, if my memory serves me right, that voted against Russia's involvement in Ukraine. So it's telling 1 out of 54. It's telling indeed. And going further, also, part of Russia's strategy in Africa is much more than even the Green Deal. There's the debt relief. There's a debt relief strategy, which in the Russia Africa summit that just took place a few weeks ago,
Mhm.
Putin waived off, I think, 20 something billion dollars of debt. So again, countries who are not at the receiving end of a Green Deal are at the receiving end of debt relief. So again, the US needs to understand that Russia's influence in the continent is rising.
Mhm.
And in terms of rolling it back or contesting it, it has to employ strategies that are for the benefit of Africans. Because in the long run, yes, at the top level, there's a contest for influence, there's a Cold War 2.0, there's a scramble. The people on ground do not understand that. What the people on ground understand is certain partners create certain outcomes, and certain partners create certain outcomes. So we're going to lean towards the one that psychologically seems like an equal partner to them. And that is what Russia is shaping itself to be on the African continent.
One particularly interesting event that happened during the summit that you mentioned is the offer of a free personal helicopter to one of the African leaders by Putin personally. And I'm wondering what kind of message that sends when he is offering a personal gift to a potential leader as opposed to some offer that benefits the people of that country. Do you think gestures like that outright embrace kind of corrupt or self-serving practices, how can they be used to offset this very assertive and successful push by Russia to engage the African populations?
I think gestures like that are to the benefit of the political leadership. Russia, to an extent, understands the psychology of these leaders. If you pay attention to the Russia African Summit, it's a sharp contrast to the US African Summit. In the US African Summit, there's a lot of talk about deals being struck, about business partnerships, about funding. But in the in the Russian African Summit, is debt relief, it's also military equipment. African leaders get to see the equipment that their soldiers buy and engage with them in real time. So this psychological lost power, the Russians understand it and they are playing on it.
So this is you make something very, very important because on the one hand, US, to the extent US understands partnerships, it looks at partnerships as specifically things that kind of include investments and benefits to the broad cross-section of population. But in Russia's view, this view of partnership is partnership with, whoever is in power. It's a power play. And likewise, the local regimes operate in terms of language of power. So these things are very contrasting, they're contradictory, they're understandable, and yet they also contrast very much with this whole concept of populations who want to see equal partnerships, but yet they see all these, they see corruption and a history of corruption. They see that Russia is playing to the interests of the governments and power play. Do they perceive these power moves as something beneficial to themselves as well? Or is there some other reason why they interpret that sort of appeal as personally as a partnership with the country itself and not just with power players?
I think it's an issue of perception, and as you know, perception is reality. So,
Mhm.
commonsensically, one would think that they should decipher that, oh, look, Russia's And Russia's strategy is clearly leaning towards political leadership and engaging with them to the detriment of the populace. But again, given the baggage that they have and prejudice against the West, it's not exactly clear for them. They don't see things clearly. There's a lot of
Mhm.
fog that has been created by prejudice. So as opposed to seeing things clearly the way I would, for instance, they don't. Now, I'm not from Francophone Africa. I'm a Nigerian, so it's easy for me to pontificate around these issues and puncture holes and say, well, you know what, this is the problem and this is what they should rather do. But being caught in that storm of decades of prejudice being built up, what we are seeing really is perception being reality.
Mhm. And some people might even see these sort of gestures as a sign of respect and not even, anything objectionable.
True, true, true. Again, that's a fair point because I mean they might see it as a sign of respect, as a sign of regard. And again, perception here, perception
Mhm.
here.
Yes, because in the US, yes, it's common to give some small, tokens of appreciation to visiting heads of states or whatever, but something very extravagant is seen as a corrupt effort to influence the local politics. But that may not necessarily be the case everywhere around the world. It could be perfectly natural to
True,
give
true.
very, very, very extravagant gifts to local leaders as a sign of respect, and that is another issue of, I think, miscommunication between Western audiences observing these events and the way these events actually, why they are actually successful. um the US Russian, I mean, the African Russian summit was very poorly covered in the West, and the main takeaway from the social media accounts was Prigozhin's presence, which very much established him as part of the official foreign policy and not some rogue actor who is making strange deals in the shadows. Um, that was, and even after that, people refer to his alleged mutiny as a, as a rift, which, had there been a rift, he clearly would not have been able to participate in official foreign policy uh, events of that sort. But not much has been said actually about the relative successes or failures of the diplomacy itself, and I think this is where there's a lot more homework to be done by the political class and the decision making in the West. Well, thank you so much for providing these very valuable insights. And one of the reasons I call my website and my show, The Washington Outsider, is precisely because I try to zoom out of the very localized Washington-driven perspectives on global politics and geopolitics, and to try to provide a diversity of views and understanding of the way locals perceive these issues, because perception can very much differ, and there isn't and if you try to make policy and decisions based only on what you want to see, you're never going to get it right. um and I appreciate for giving us this opportunity to look at it from a very different angle. um to those watching the
Yeah,
show,
thank you for having me.
we'll be back again next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as usual. We had Yusuf Gupa with us discussing the recent coup in Niger, in what that means in terms of Wagner's expanding influence in Africa. And yes, it's expanding contrary to the rumors that Wagner is facing difficulties. Apparently not quite, if it's making one political success after another for now. And thank you for watching us. Thank you for staying with us, and have a great night. Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.